Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the team Calcutta Comparatists 1919, I take this privilege to warmly welcome you to the 75th lecture of the online lecture series. Calcutta Comparatists 1919 is an independent forum for research scholars of humanities and social sciences. It carries the legacy of academic study of Indian languages and literatures, envisioned by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee and introduced in 1919 at the University of Calcutta. Later in 2005, a new department was established which still continues to carry research in Indian languages. Calcutta Comparatives 1919 took inspiration from this history and it is a platform for sharing research interests and ideas. We are organizing online lectures on various interdisciplinary topics to be delivered by academicians and distinguished research scholars of different fields. Your remarkable skills will be a great addition to our team. We look forward to a mutually beneficial relationship with you. Thank you for joining us today. Now, I would like to request Purbasha Mondol to kindly introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jemima. In today's session, we will listen to Professor Simon Deering, who is the Professorial Fellow at the University of Melbourne, Australia. Professor Simon Deering completed his PhD on George Eliot at the University of Cambridge. He had done his BA from Victoria University and MA from the University of Auckland. He joined the English department at the University of Melbourne in 1983 as a tutor. After visiting positions at the University of Auckland and the Rhetoric Department, UC Berkeley, he was appointed Robert Wallace Professor at Melbourne in 1993. As head of department there in the late 1990s, he was instrumental in establishing the cultural studies, media, and the communications and publishing programs. Between 2002 to 2010, Simon Deering was a professor of English at Johns Hopkins University, where he also served as director of the film and the media program. Between 2010 and 2017, he was a research professor at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Queensland, as well as holding visiting positions at University of Cambridge, Freie Universität Berlin, the American Academy of Rome, and elsewhere. In 2019, Professor Deering received Kerala's Higher Education Council's Erudite Scholar Award. He has made contributions to the studies of post-colonialism, secularism, Australian and New Zealand literatures, as well as to cultural studies. But he has primarily focused on relations between literary and cultural history and European, mainly British literature. His books are Foucault and Literature, published in 1991, Patrick White, 1994, Exit Capitalism, Literary Culture, Theory and Post-Secular Modernity, 2010, Against Democracy, Literary Experience in the Era of Emancipations, 2012, Cultural Studies, A Critical Introduction, 2005, The Cultural Studies Reader, 3rd Expanded Edition, 2007, Modern Enchantments, The Cultural and Secular Power of Magic, 2002. The title of his talk today is Thinking with Edward Said, Decolonization, Rest, and the Western Humanities. I welcome you to our digital platform, Professor Simon Deering, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you here. Now you may start your lecture. This virtual floor is yours. Over to you, Professor Deering.
Thank you very much, Prabhasha. And thank you very much for having me. We're all aware of the catastrophe, the COVID catastrophe here in India. And we talked about how appropriate and sensitive it was to give a talk like this during this time, but it was agreed that perhaps at least some semblance of normality in everyone's life might be worth maintaining. All right. In this talk, I want to think about what it means to decolonize the humanities. To do so, I'll lean on Edward Said, whose book Orientalism inaugurated academic post-colonialism in 1978 and drew attention to the Western cultural heritage dependence on imperialism and thus drove efforts to decolonize the humanities. But Said is also important to me because, somewhat against forces he himself launched, he was also one of the West's high humanities staunchest defenders. If we're to think about reasons why we might want to remain committed to transmitting the Western, the European heritage, while also accepting that it was a product and instrument of imperialism and its horrors, Said remains fundamental. In beginning to ponder this question, I soon realized that decolonization needs to be considered in the light of other pressures on the humanities at the moment too, including the new academic managerialism, which is playing such a role in the West, and in our context too, the decline of print. Just to concentrate on the last of these, the decline of print, while we're all now aware of the relationship between imperialism and the European cultural heritage, the fact that the modern humanities were a product of a particular technology, print, along with the fact that print is now being marginalized in the current technosphere, has been less widely discussed, although it is, if anything, more obvious. There exist relationships between decolonization and the marginalization of print. It's not just that the era in which print was dominant, from the mid-15th century to about 2000, overlaps pretty closely with the era of Western global expansion, but that the decline of print changes the status of the Western written heritage in general. And here in this talk, I want to suggest that the high Western heritage, the cultural heritage, the literary cultural heritage, the decolonization of that works in the opposite direction to its technological marginalization. On the one side, processes of decolonization devalue and displace the traditional Western canon, while on the other side, print's marginalization turns that canon into a beleaguered heritage which requires protection. So the point I'm making is that the association with imperialism decenters and takes value away from the canon, but the fact that that canon was and still is a print canon, and print itself is becoming beleaguered, threatened, means that we can have we also need to protect it. To Said then, as is well known, Orientalism had a profound impact on the humanities because, drawing on Michel Foucault as well as on thinkers from outside the West, it made a sweeping claim, or at least was received as making a sweeping claim, about the relationship between Europe's power over and its knowledge of the East. Europe, Said famously argued, pictured and described the Orient reductively as other. It did so in philological, geographical, and historical scholarship, but also in pictures, poems, operas, and novels. Even for Europeans of goodwill, there was no easy escape from the self-interested and largely imaginary understanding of the East, which could only be interrupted, Said argued, by listening to non-Europeans themselves, by engaging in genuine dialogue across borders. Said's deployment of Foucauldian theory onto imperialist power-knowledge relations, which was controversial at first, was soon extended and enacted, for instance, by welcoming more non-European texts into Western curricula and therefore moving into world literature. Said himself made a major contribution to this extension of post-colonial thought in his Culture and Imperialism, 1993, which addressed not just Orientalism, but Western culture as a whole. In elaborating his paradigm in that book, though, Said's understanding of how cultural imperialism works was transformed. Today, Culture and Imperialism reads as a somewhat anxious book. It is almost as concerned to parry the post-colonialism that appeared in Orientalism's wake as it is to tribunalize or to critique imperialism. Squeezed between the traditional Eurocentric culture idea and post-colonialism in its identity politics form, Said makes a number of key arguments, and these are the arguments that he makes in that book. First of all, Culture is what he calls affiliated. All cultural products, all made things have wide and varied conditions and connections, which are sometimes openly acknowledged and often not. Affiliated culture is also secular. That is to say, it is practically engaged in the lived here and now, or what Said called after Raymond Williams, worldly situations. Culture knows no beginning or end, and it's constantly changing. In cultural imperialism, it's less a matter of Europe othering the cultures and societies it colonized than of European cultures becoming more and more widely connected across the globe, even if on territories it had secured by misrecognition and violent expropriation. Secondly, modern cultures are relatively autonomous. That means they are partly independent of the social and political structures out of which they appear. They possess their own qualities which cannot be understood or assessed merely on political terms or in terms of power relations. Third, Said's embrace of affiliation means that fixed identities are closures. Identities artificially cut off connections, affiliations. Thus, for instance, for Said, French or African cultures are not only of and for Africans or the French. All cultures are for everyone. This universalist thesis is the basis of Said's humanism, and he becomes a defender of humanism in those terms. Last, those most involved in creating and reflecting on cultures do so precisely as individuals. This is because, at least ideally, they do not bring identities to bear on their work, identities either of gender, nation, class, caste, or race. Reflective secular individuals of the kind Said imagined belonging to no place or group are, as he liked to say, in exile. So the humanist is in exile. The humanist does not operate out of their identities, of any kind of identities. However, as exilic individuals, they may take on various roles. In particular, they may act as intellectuals, as, for instance, when they support and represent a particular movement to a larger public, as Said himself famously, courageously did on behalf of the Palestinians, to whom he was attached by blood. Or they may act as humanists when they receive, study, and transmit the global heritage. Or they may act as critics when, drawing on what they have learned from the affiliative richness of received print culture, they take up critique in order to denounce, for instance, misrecognitions or closures of the Orientalist kind, or identity politics, simplifications, and abstractions. Said's attempt to reconcile the living value of the Western heritage with the understanding that it was largely based on oppression and expropriation is, I think, less than smooth. In particular, his affirmation of affiliation cuts across his understanding of culture's partial independence from power. The first works to connect and associate, the second goes the other way. Said's work also now belongs to a previous generation. Recent research on Western imperialism, for instance, has transformed our understanding of Europe's relation to the rest of the world in terms he could not have known about. Among the experts, imperialism is now thought of as more porous and plural than it was 30 years ago. Much of this recent scholarship, however, can be reconciled to Said's most insistent argument that societies and cultures, including imperialist societies and cultures, are constitutively affiliative and not disconnected to their others, but share and join and connect in constantly mutating ways. But and this is the point that I really want to emphasize in this talk, it is harder to reconcile Said's work to the increased scholarly emphasis on race and racism in the years since his death. Today, now, when we think of decolonization, we tend to think of white supremacy rather than imperialism as its object. Imperialism being, at least in its formal phase, now more than 50 years dead. Said's whole intellectual orientation does not work as well when race rather than imperialism is in question. The logic of race is different from the logic of empire. Racism was a basis of Western imperialism, of course, but this does not mean that racism and imperialism can be identified with one another. The two categories have not just different histories, but different conceptual structures. Race is, after all, a strange concept. It's supposed to be located in the body, but modern biology recognizes no human races. This means that race and racism order many societies, despite the fact that races as such don't actually exist. This paradox can be easily overlooked because race quickly stands in for other things, for skin color and ethnicity, or for sort of filiative identifications, for instance. At any rate, race talk allows hard differences to operate socially. Race is of nature before it is of culture. Against this, as Said insisted, cultures don't sustain hard differences. Race, the concept of race's introduction of natural differences, of apparently natural differences into the political and cultural scene has further consequences. There's an important sense in which it is easy to become a racist in resistance to racism, since to be identified as belonging to a subjugated race or to accept that identification is to be joined willy-nilly to the race concept's naturalist logic. No less powerfully, to point out race's conceptual problems, the fact that it doesn't actually exist in its own terms, may be to find oneself on the side of the dominant white order, partly because this insight, however epistemologically valid, can reduce opportunities for correction and resistance. The expansion of race thinking into Anglophone post-colonialism and thence more generally into the Western humanities and indeed into society has been a complex event triggering intense sensitivities. Scholarship on its progress remains thin, but two of its aspects seem significant for us. The turn from empire to race underpins the current movement to decolonize the humanities. Let me repeat, in the 50s and early 60s, decolonizing meant the ending of formal colonial governance. It now usually means marginalizing the Western canon on the grounds that it is an instrument and expression of white, male, cis supremacy. It thus poses a formidable threat to Said's sense that all cultures, on whatever side of the old imperial divide, colonizers or colonized, are affiliative and for everyone. Said was personally interested in a fairly traditional white canon, even if he was, of course, aware that that canon had been put to imperialist uses, and also sometimes argued that insistence on canonicity itself, on there being a canon, could help neutralize the humanities. But he wrote about Jonathan Swift, Jane Austen, Joseph Conrad, E.M. Forster, Friedrich Nietzsche, Erich Auerbach, alongside Mahfouz, Franz Fanon, Sahil, Swift, and Elias Khoury, and did so confident that they all mattered in Egypt or Pakistan or Uganda or India. For him, as I say, they mattered everywhere. He denounced those who wanted to denigrate the European canon on political grounds. But, and this is the next important point I want to make, he did not write much about why authors like these mattered. He was, it is true, interested in thinking about literary method as a means for extracting all of literature's associations and all its cultural power. He also sometimes thought about literary criticism in a broadly sociological spirit. But in the end, while his version of post-colonialism changed the canon's historical context by putting it in relation to imperialism, the value of that canon was assumed by him. He took it for granted. So his work turned out to provide little bulwark or resistance against the more stringent decolonizing race term that was to follow after his death, and little resistance too against the other powerful forces now undermining the humanities, including the internet's gradual supplantation of print culture. The internet provides what is in some ways an Edward Saïdian paradise, constructed around speed, rich networks, links. It is essentially affiliative. That's why it is now sidelining books. It also undermines hierarchies. It works horizontally, not vertically. A widely sanctioned high culture finds it hard to survive on the internet. And with the printed book retreating into cultural niches, the kinds of concentrated reading which books require or can require becomes rarer too. This matters to us for a number of reasons. The internet is probably the major force pushing literary studies to the margins. I don't think this is as true in India as it is true in the West, but literary studies are suffering huge losses of interest, losses of students, losses of prestige. And the main reason for that, I think, is that the internet is replacing print, and kids don't read books; they watch YouTube, or they do Instagram or TikTok. So it provides a practical demonstration of the limits of cultural analyses, which, like Said's, emphasize connections and flows rather than limits, hierarchies, and boundaries. Then, too, it may be that in the academy, at least, the surge in race talk, the emphasis now on race and racism, is to be regarded as partly an effort to go against the internet's radical affiliativeness and de-hierarchizing powers by asserting differences that seem to be based in nature. Racism, anti-racism talk, appealing to apparent natural kinds, restores a certain epistemic and ethical stability within digitalized discourse. My main point, however, is that Said's refashioning of the Western canon presupposed the primacy of print technology in the same way that, as we'll see, it assumed academic autonomy and freedom, at least in the US, and downplayed the role of race, both in imperialism and in contemporary Western cultural life. So how did Said think we should receive the Western literary heritage? For this, he famously turned to philology. This separated him from the modern Anglophone criticism developed in the wake of T.S. Eliot and I.A. Richards' pioneering efforts, which had been so important to the 20th century English department. I don't know if you're aware of this, but really modern English studies begins with T.S. Eliot and I.A. Richards' work just in the immediately after the First World War. Said believed that the new criticism, as this sort of criticism came to be called in the States, the new criticism's concentration on Anglophone individual text ensnared it in conservatism. He thought that kind of criticism was conservative. Not by chance, he positioned himself institutionally as much as he could in comparative literature, at some distance from English departments and its genealogies, even though he stayed in an English department. Philology also separated Said from the phenomenology and post-structuralism in which he had first made his name in his book Joseph Conrad and the Fiction of Autobiography, his first book in the late 60s, Beginnings in the mid-70s, and Orientalism itself. But which, he came to think, post-structuralism, I'm talking about here, removed language and semiotic structures from their lived settings and thus distorted them. Post-structuralism wasn't to him in practice secular or affiliative enough. His philological method also detached Said from more recent political forms of criticism, such as feminism, which from his perspective neither sufficiently acknowledged culture's relative autonomy from the political, nor sufficiently respected its affiliative energies insofar as it insisted on an identity, i.e. being a woman. Said's philology was something very particular. It had little in common with the discipline that European magisterial philologists like Franz Bopp and Ulrich Wilhelmowitz Merlendorf had developed. For Said, philology was associated with pre-modern Arabic Quranic scholarship, but also more immediately with a few hallowed European names, Vico, Nietzsche, and Auerbach. It also overlapped with Raymond Williams's work too. At its heart lay a vitalist understanding of language. Said, as a philologist, understood language, and especially literary language, to carry what he called an originary power through which human beings invent themselves as a unique form, as he put it in Viconian terms. In Said, Vico's insistence that what has been made by humans is what can be understood by humans merges with Nietzsche's claim that humans make or do things in the service of a will to power, as well as with Auerbach's progressivist Christian humanism, with its praise of European culture's incarnational, that is to say, Christological, Christ being the incarnated God, European culture's incarnational or worldly orientation. It is on this basis that he believed that a firm focus on language in the world lay at the heart of the humanities as a whole. The analysis of literary language inside concrete lived and political situations was, so Said thought, best exemplified in Raymond Williams's The Country and City, and The Country and the City, and in practice, Said's philology is very close to Williams's New Left historicism. In The Return to Philology, the essay in which Said spells out his literary method, or his later literary method, most carefully, literary criticism is thought of as possessing two distinct moments: first reception and then resistance. Reception names the concentrated effort to understand and accept texts through close attention not just to the words on the page, like the new critics, but to a writer's historical context as well. On the other hand, resistance turns from those texts to the world as it now is, looks out at the world. In particular, it denounces failures to honor the affiliative reach, the connectivity, the sense of history, differences, and freedom, which you can get to know about by immersing yourself in the print archive philologically. Said's name for such resistance was, of course, critique. This method also led Said towards a broad cultural sociology. What kind of collectives and institutions could shelter literary reception and cultural critique of this kind? Addressing that question in his 1982 essay, Opponents, Audiences, Constituencies and Community, he insisted that the modern university provided the best home for criticism. This was especially so in the US, where academic freedom was widely accepted, and the system, while he was alive, was still protected from forces later on to be called managerial and neoliberal. So he died before all that hit. So he had this idealistic sense of the university as the place where you could do criticism, both as receiving the canon and then using that as a point to critique from. But there were problems with the academy for Said, in particular professionalism, the obsession with careerism and bureaucratic and disciplinarity tended to remove scholars and critics from worldly and political participation. He was basically an enemy of professionalism and disciplinarity. It's in this suspicion of disciplinarity and academic neutrality that Said maybe seems most dated now that race thinking is so widespread, now that print is being marginalized, now that the university system is losing its independence from market forces. Said's belief that literary reception flows relatively easy into critique can no longer be sustained. Or to put this another way, it's now clearer than ever that the role of the intellectual, the critic, the scholar, and the humanist can be difficult to align to one another. Is it true that close attention to the cultural archive fuels resistance to hegemony? Is it true that society or academic managers will support the humanities if they regard themselves to be primarily involved in critique? To ask such questions is to join the current post-critique movement in a rather qualified way, since I think we need to accept that the print-based humanities now rebukes the market-oriented internet culture around them simply by being there. The humanities pose a challenge to dominant cultural forms by not being economically efficient and productive, by being old, exotic, print-based, and thus relatively hard to access intellectually and physically, and by being in their basis secular. Their untimeliness in all those ways is now, it's just in itself critical. For all that, however, I think Said was right not to focus on the European canon's internal qualities and values. Here, however, things get tricky. Let me pass lightly over complicated philosophical arguments and just say that the Western heritage in the humanities cannot be defended by reasoning. Of course, defenders of the humanities sometimes argue that, however inefficient, the humanities do have some economic utility. Some also claim that the humanities encourage dispositions, for instance, empathy and tolerance, that are required by a good society. But such rationalist arguments are instrumental. They defend the humanities not for what they are, but for what they supposedly can do. They expose the humanities to external measure and so cede the humanities' independent value. Furthermore, the humanities cannot defend themselves by appealing to preferences they themselves have nurtured. For instance, the society's need for cultivated individuals. To do that would be not just tautological, but plainly self-interested. No, the humanities must be regarded as autotelic, worth studying and transmitting for their own sake. But this claim to pure value is something you accept or you don't. You either accept it or you don't. It's, if you like, intuitive. And the same is true of the humanities' content, its treasured archive, its canons. You either see that these prized objects and texts are vitally important or you don't. To make this rather brutal claim is to take us back to the very beginnings of modern Anglophone literary criticism. By that I mean it returns us to English studies as they were conceptualized in T.S. Eliot's groundbreaking essays published around 1919, in another period when heritage was under pressure and criticism's relation to its object was being rethought. So I want to finish this talk by returning to one particular essay, Eliot's The Function of Criticism, 1923, which did a lot to begin the 20th century discipline of English, precisely by addressing itself to the question Said neglected, that is, how are we to maintain the literary heritage, the literary canon? Today, Eliot's essay, The Function of Criticism, reads almost as if it's written in a foreign tongue. But a century ago, it set out a way of thinking strong and original enough to help revivify the literary archive and so inaugurate the modern discipline of English. Keeping Eliot's essay and all its present strangeness in mind in relation to Said may help us preserve English now that the discipline is dissolving. Eliot begins by insisting that, quote, literature of the world, literature of Europe, literature of a single country make up a, quote, whole to which the individual is to, quote, devote and surrender themselves in order to become a, quote, true rather than a, quote, second-rate writer. True writers do not want to express their individuality or to assert what he called trifling differences, but to orientate themselves to the tradition's discursive resources and principles. They do not express their personal experiences, which become rather an unconscious medium, or what he called a catalyst for good writing. They're not expressed, they catalyze. For Eliot, what is true of the creative writer is partly true of the critic too. One reason for this is that all creative writing involves criticism, because writers must judge what works and what doesn't as they draft their texts, and do so in terms of what is and what is not meretricious more generally. Critics' ultimate purpose for Eliot was to help creative writers succeed. But the obverse is not true. Criticism is not itself creative, because unlike literature, it is not autotelic, it provides a service. What more precisely is Eliot's concept of criticism then? Criticism is not interpretation. For him, interpretation is aligned to individualism and the cultivation of small differences for purposes of, quote, self-assertion. Criticism is not Arnoldian either. It doesn't aim at any kind of civilizational perfection or best self. It has no missionary or imperialist ambitions. Criticism is rather, in a famous phrase, the common pursuit of true judgment, a true judgment which calls upon, quote, comparison and analysis, and which aims at the, quote, elucidation of works, as well as what he called the correction of taste. Unexpectedly, criticism in pursuit of true judgment most requires of the critic and the teacher of literature a, quote, very highly developed sense of fact. Eliot tells us that when he taught university extensions classes, he wasn't an academic, of course, but he did a bit of teaching when he was younger. He found that what best helped students to understand difficult text was sharing facts about them with the students. Facts also have the enormous advantage, so Eliot thought, of being incapable of corrupting taste. They are merely true or false. Once the facts about texts and their historical circumstances are in, once analytic comparisons with other texts have been made, the text can be elucidated and judgments made. The judgments themselves are spontaneous and intuitive, just like the judgment that the heritage and canon as a whole are, as it were, spiritually important to us. You either you make your judgment, there are no reasons for it. Eliot ends this essay by claiming that this mode of criticism can provide the possibility of cooperative activity, as he put it, because it is not individualistic or based on a social identity. It, in that way, strengthens what he calls the polity of literature and criticism. He also declares that his obvious failure to define the terms he's using, truth or fact or reality, isn't a problem, because he tended merely, as he put it, to find a scheme in which whatever they are, those concepts are, that they will fit if they exist. If they exist, if these things exist, facts, truth, reality. Eliot's essay is a daring synthesis of three dominant philosophical schools of his time: idealism and its insistence on wholes, its critique of identity thinking, and its subtle displacement of historicism; logical positivism and its emphasis on facts and truth; and pragmatism in its admission that it has constructed a mere scheme, albeit one that might just work. I don't want to think about Eliot intellectually historically, though. I just want to note that these days his dismissal of interpretation and critique, his refusal to bind the heritage to nations or identities, his insistence that criticism involves judgment and making distinctions between good, lasting writing and writing that won't find its way into the tradition, his emphasis on the importance of facts and comparison for criticism and literary pedagogy, his avoidance of the idea that the literary heritage stores morality or values, all offer stronger grounds for attracting public support for academic literary studies than the more highly professionalized and politically engaged conditions increasingly around the concept of race that we usually turn to today. From this perspective, it's important not to forget that Edward Said can be considered a follower of Eliot, however uncomfortable that idea would no doubt have made him. Like Eliot, he insisted on worlding literature. Eliot's facts can be thought of as approximate equivalent to Said's affiliations. Both turn our attention from the text to its relations to the world, while maintaining its limited autonomy. Like Eliot too, Said gratefully received heritage and tradition. Indeed, he became a great critic because he presented the heritage he served with one grand fact, the fact of imperialism. And Said is probably the most important and most famous and impactful literary criticism of his generation because of that. He presented the heritage with one grand fact, the fact of imperialism. It's a matter of history that when the Western humanities fully observed that grand and tragic fact, and that when they went on to receive another grand fact, the fact of systemic racism, their capacity to receive and accept the canon was undermined. This canon stopped being autotelic. It became instead an instrument of the cruel and unjust society in which it had been nurtured. At the same time, the capacity to intuit and judge the heritage's qualities more or less disappeared. People stopped being able to make those intuitive judgments or want to make them. But if we're to save what remains, Eliot's stripped back criticism, which now seems so foreign to us, might be appealed to, not least because it resonates so suggestively with Edward Said's thought, as I'm suggesting. So let's not forget that when Said pointed out that Jane Austen's Mansfield Park needed to be read alongside the fact of slavery, he did not urge us to abandon Mansfield in the interests of decolonization. On the contrary, it's truer to Said's spirit to think like this, though he didn't himself ever quite put it like this. This is a harder-edged version of his thought. Once one has intuited and received Mansfield Park's cultural qualities, once one has judged that it is important that the novel be transmitted down across later generations, that gives us all the more reason to condemn slavery. Slavery closed down on the independence, the leisure, the wit and love of literature, which Austen's fiction imaginatively realizes. Austen's fictions are so imaginatively subtle and engaging, not despite being written from an elite position gained by exploitation, but because they were written from such a position. In the end, it is because wit, literature, and leisure are of vital importance to free and independent individuals that slavery, which deprives people of them as well as from much else, is a crime against humanity. At the same time, however, Said could critique the Arnoldian idea of high culture into which this kind of judgment of Austen can flow. Said knew that high culture, thought of as a civilizing force, had been one of nationalism's and imperialism's ideological resources, as he put it. But as I'm arguing here, traditional Western high culture has now a different status and function than it did in 1860 or even in 1960. Print's marginalization, along with formal decolonization and the intensified exposure of all cultural zones to market forces, has seen to that. What was once a functional resource for empire has become a bastion of resistance to global capitalism's technologies and logics. Practices of canon reception have become practices of resistance, as Said already understood. It's time that this profound shift in what it means for the humanities were more widely recognized. Okay, thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for this very enlightening lecture. Am I audible, Professor?
Yep.
Thank you so much. This is very enlightening, and Said was a phenomenon. I mean, it was not just a critic, writer, theorist, but he was a phenomenal. And maybe we can see if there are some questions from the audience. Still now we don't. Yes, Professor, you're saying something?
How will I know there are questions? Will they come up?
I'll show them. I'll show them.
Oh,
Mostly we have comments till now. We don't have any questions yet. We just have comments. We haven't got any questions, but still our participants can still post some questions or comments if they want to. We still have some time. We can take them. And like seriously, like when you're talking about Austen and reading Austen from that perspective, we never do that. It's
you
like
don't do that?
normally we don't do that. Like normally, like especially when we read Austen in our undergrad days, it was mostly in the like it's romantic comedy. It's from that era and everything. We never read from this perspective. These are like newer ways to read a text.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the ironies is that a lot of places outside the West are often more traditional in the way they teach than now, particularly in the States, I think. Whereas I think now if you teach Austen in the States, it's very hard to think of it outside of like the question of slavery or the question of imperialism. You know, that's the standard way of thinking about it. I think.
But like when we read Joseph Conrad, we started with the thinking of only imperialism and colonization and domination. So these are like very, I mean, obviously, so there are many aspects to a text. We have to keep in mind that.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
we have some questions from the audience. And the first question is from Shoikot Pradhan. I'll show it in the screen. I'll read it, Professor. But certain traditional individual talent talks about the mind of Europe.
Mhm.
For him, great artists only exist in Europe. Don't you think he's being a bit elitist here?
I don't know if you know this, but Eliot spent 3 years studying Sanskrit. He tried to be a Sanskrit scholar. He didn't think the great artists only exist in Europe. That's not what Eliot thought. He was, he was particularly interested in ancient South Asian cultures. And in fact, the wasteland, has that. There's referred to. But he did think, he thought he thought he was European, and he thought that his work was connected to the mind of Europe, not to the mind of India. Which is true. But I don't think he was. I mean, he was elitist in the sense that he thought that, some literature was a lot better than others. If that's elitist, he thought that. But he wasn't. He was interested in popular culture too. He was a great fan of music halls. Those days were the mass commercial culture. He wasn't. He is the beginning of cultural studies, Eliot. His later works influenced Raymond Williams and Leavis, and that's where British cultural studies comes from, which is the opposite of elitist. It's true, though, that Eliot was an Anglican. He converts to Anglicanism after he wrote this essay I talked about. He converts to Anglicanism and becomes a very conservative Anglican, and does say, for instance, things like, well, there wouldn't be a problem with the English in India if the Indians had converted to Christianity. He thought that would have been the solution. And that, I don't think that's exactly elitist, but it's certainly not liberal. But he believed in the truth. He believed in the revelation. He believed that God was what the Christians knew, not what anyone else knew. Later in his life, he did. That's what he believed. And he believed the Anglican Church was the institution which had the right idea about God.
And talking about cultural studies, like not only Raymond Williams or Eliot, but like from our undergrad days, we have considered you as one of the founders as well. We have
Yes,
read you.
which it's
Yes.
not really true, but
But for
I
us,
did
we
that.
have been one of our inspirations since so
Yeah,
long time ago.
that's because I published a textbook that got very, very widely read. But I'm not.
Yes.
I wasn't. The real cultural studies people would not think of me as a cultural studies person. But I know I've been to India a few times, and I know that in India and in China, people think I am one of the key cultural studies people in China, particularly, which is because it's all been translated in there. But back here, nobody thinks that. In the States, I don't think.
But that's not true. You're one of the like living legend of cultural studies.
Yeah.
Our next question is from Anisa Fatima. She's asking, Hamid Dabashi terms some of the exiles like Azan Nafisi as comproder intellectuals, who he says advance the US imperialist ambitions in the Middle East by criticizing their homeland. Would you agree?
No. I think I mean I certainly from a sort of Said point of view, you have to be, Said criticized Arafat very intensely. He tried to do Said tried to do all the work that he could for Palestine, for Palestine against Israeli occupation, but that certainly did not mean that he couldn't critique Palestinians when they, by his view, made mistakes or committed injustices. And although for someone like myself, I'm not in a position where I have to live that out, obviously, I would agree with Said. I think Said was a very brave person who told it like he saw it to anyone. And I think sort of that's the best attitude to have.
Thank you, Professor. Our next question, like many people have show the comments, they're thanking you and everything. Thank you, sir. And next question is from Simran Biswas. She is asking, what is the role of high culture in understanding what race is and the formation of nation later?
I don't think high culture has a relation to race particularly. I mean, race is I don't know what you guys think about race. And I'm not an academic expert on it either, but race is a 19th century concept. If we're talking about the concept of race, it's really mainly a 19th century concept. It's not only, but mainly. And they go through this period, as I'm sure you all know, scientific racism, where they believe that the human species was divided into different races. And then you could think that the human species was divided into human races without thinking that some race was naturally better than others, and some people didn't think that. But then some people, some racists who believed in this concept of race, did think that some races, and for traditionally one such candidate for being the highest race was the Aryans, and the Aryans, weirdly enough, contained both South Asians and whites. We together were all Aryans, and we were superior to everyone else. That was one. Others, of course, thought that white people from the north of England, so they didn't think all white people. They thought that Slavs and Celts were not as good as northern whites, Nordic whites. So there were all these versions of this. Some imperialists thought this, but not many. Not many British imperialists were racist of that sort. What British imperialists were, particularly in the 19th and 20th century, they had a sort of basic arrogance that their cultures were more advanced. Their culture was more civilizationally advanced. But that's not itself racism necessarily. You can have a culture that's advanced without it being racist, right? It's a culture, it's a cultural idea, not a racist idea. So, where race really matters is in cases like the US in slavery, where you get very, very, very well worked out, oppression of the whites against the blacks. And I think in a country like India, you can argue, but my understanding is race is not the key concept to what divides caste, religion. Caste, some people would think of as having a sort of race-type characteristics, but it's not race. There's a difference between caste and race.
Different.
So the notion that everything is race is an American idea, really, because in America it is. America is a deeply systemic racist country, in my view. But in places, and then there are certainly Asian racisms. The Chinese and the Japanese have both have racist attitudes sometimes towards other people who are not Chinese or Japanese. But it's not as important in their societies as it is in the States. So, racism, I don't think high culture and race have much to do with each other.
Thank you, Professor. In the context of India, racism is also a problem, because we have both Indo-Aryan races, the Mongoloid and the
Yes.
Austroasiatic, so that becomes a problem at times. And then
I'm not saying there's no issues in probably in any country, but not to the same degree. It's not as absolutely central to the society in the way that I think is genuinely in the US. I mean, and you certainly, in most societies you get racists. There are a few racists, but in the US it's structural. I think it's structural. You can't understand American history without understanding white supremacy, basically.
Exactly. She also has another question. I'll take it together. How did the increased scholarly works on racism impact decolonization?
Well, my argument in this is that decolonization changes its meaning. Decolonization first means what it literally means getting rid of the colonies, and in a formal sense, basically by 1965, Britain in particular and France didn't have colonies anymore. So they decolonized. They would say they went through the process of decolonization. But now decolonization doesn't mean it. It's not about governments. It's not about the breaking down of the old British Empire or the British Commonwealth. Or the French equivalents of that. It's about race. It's about marginalizing, taking white writing out of the center. And I think that's what it means. That's now pretty much what it means. And plus also reminding us of the relationship between imperialism, racism, and culture generally. That's what decolonization, I think, means. And then, also getting rid of the canons, of taking down the statues of people like Rhodes, or, getting rid of the traces where you seem to be celebrating racists, getting rid of that. Or imperialists. So I think my point is the word sort of means something different today than it did originally.
And if you talk about neo-colonialism, then decolonization it's an ongoing process. We cannot only decolonize or decolonize our mind as end of the same. Can you really decolonize?
Well, I don't know. You can. To me, decolonization makes sense in some contexts and not so much sense in others. I think if you take the sort of Edward Said line, which is that all cultures are for everyone, And then you take the sort of more the literary critical, the Eliot line, which I'm arguing here is that then what the professional critic, what you do in an English department, what you should be trained to do literature, is basically to decide which works are good and which are bad, or not so bad, but which works are worth preserving for further generations. Put it like that, more neutrally. Which works are worth putting into a tradition. Then you are doing that not in relationship. You have to know the facts. You have to know the context. You have to know the facts, and your judgment will, in some extent, depend on that. But you're not judging what works are worth putting into the future on political or moral grounds. You're doing that on literary grounds, and those literary grounds are in the end intuitive. And some very nasty works are very powerful works of literature that should be read by future generations. They may actually be genuinely full of hate. They still, in my view, can be powerful works of literature. So literature that's the point of saying it's autonomous, semi-autonomous. It's got its own qualities. It cannot be, it can't be just dismissed because the writer was a racist or whatever. Lots of writers were racist, lots, Some of them wrote good books.
Yeah, it's true. Next, we have from Professor Shubhodip Ray. He's asking, do Raymond Williams and Edward Said serve to decolonize Eliot?
Well, Raymond Williams and Said didn't decolonize anyone. They didn't. The word decolonize didn't exist for them in this sense. They never. Raymond Williams was not much interested. Said, who loved Raymond Williams, thought Raymond Williams was probably the most important critic for him, who also said Raymond Williams wasn't interested enough in imperialism, which is true. So Raymond Williams has critiques of Eliot, but Raymond Williams owes much of what he did, he owes to Eliot. If there were no T.S. Eliot, there'd be no Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams inherits from T.S. Eliot. Said didn't like Eliot, not because he was anti-Semitic, which he also was when he was young, at least, and not because he was conservative, but because he thought he was. Because he was politically or religiously conservative or religious, and Said did not like religious people. Said was a secularist. He was quite a combative secularist. He would not have liked the BJP, for instance, on those sorts of grounds. But Said thought that Eliot was too canonical. That Eliot didn't contextualize literature enough in the right way. That's really what he would have thought. But I would argue that Said too owes a lot to Eliot, and that Said's basic approach to literature is like T.S. Eliot.
And Dr. Mohammed Bikaruddin is asking, is there a description of political culturalism in Edward Said's work?
What is political culturalism?
That's exactly what I was thinking. Don't understand what he's meaning by political culturalism.
I don't. Do you?
We can maybe move on to the next question because I don't really understand the word political culturalism. Vijay Shitture is asking, how does Edward Said deconstruct the colonization through his literary work like Orientalism? I think you have very much covered this in your lecture.
I'm happy to. I don't think Edward Said didn't deconstruct in a technical sense. Like he didn't like Derrida. He really did not like Derrida's work. He did not like post-structuralism of that sort. In Orientalism, he uses Foucault. It's not really about colonization, but it is indirectly. The point of Orientalism, as you probably know, is that a bunch of white people, Europeans, had done research on the Orient and produced this image of the Orient, these ideas of the Orient, without really talking to or knowing about what it was actually like. And there was no such thing as the Orient anyway, because India isn't the same as Saudi Arabia, and Palestine isn't the same as China. The Orient was an imaginary fiction invented by these people because it helped England dominate the world. So yes, he does deconstruct colonization in a very broad sense. Like he thinks that idea of the Orient that they produced helped European domination of the globe. Now, how true that idea really was and how powerful those sorts of idea of the Orient was for imperialism is another question. You have to then ask, well, what really went on with that European expansion? What did it mean? How did it work in different places? Because again, the English relationship to, say, India, and the English relationship to Egypt, and the English relationship to China, the English relation to Zimbabwe, as it now is, and the English relation to New Zealand is very, very different. So there's all kinds of different things going on in imperialism. It's not just as Orientalism is not a true idea because there's no such thing as the Orient. When you really get down to it, there's no such thing as imperialism because it took all these different forms. European expansion and expropriation and control took all these different forms.
That's right. We have another one from Shulka Pradhan. So do you think that the diasporic communities, culturally hybrid people, have no quote-unquote home, living in what Salman Rushdie calls quotes, imaginary homelands, or everywhere is their home?
Well, Said thought if you were going to be a individual, you were always in exile. That's what he thought. If you were really going to be an individual, you had no home. As soon as you have a home, you're putting limits on yourself. As soon as you say, that's who I am, that's where I come from, you're putting limits on yourself. So it wasn't a matter of culturally hybrid people. Said thought if you were going to be an individual, and he thought that you had to be an individual if you're going to be a good critic and a good humanist, because that's where you had to start from, being an individual. But an individual was not bound to identity or roots. It was freeing yourself from it. So that's what I'm just parroting Said here. That's what he thought. And it's very confronting. It's not the way we think anymore. We don't think like that. We think of ourselves in races or ethnicities or religions or castes or professional identities. He thought all that was closing down on what you might be able to do to think clearly and lucidly. And the same with gender.
And coming back to the concept of Orientalism, that the white supremacy, they discovered the concept of Orient. The Orient was exactly what? Like the opposite of the Occident. Anything that is not good is
well, Said wouldn't have thought of it as white supremacy. He didn't think in terms of white supremacy. He never used those words. Those words were not popular when he wrote. They were. Okay. He thought some scholars. He was much more specific. He thought some scholars, some writers, some artists produced this image. It wasn't necessarily because they were white. Some Indians did it too. Whites weren't the only one who produced Orientalism. Indians over there. So it's not race. That's race thinking. He didn't think race. Said did not think in terms of races. It almost never mentions race. But yes, it produces the Orient as other. But not. I think Said, surely later in his life, wouldn't have even thought that all knowledge produced in Europe about India in the 19th century was Orientalist. Or at least it wasn't all Orientalist to the same degree. He had his favorites. He had people, some of those people found out a lot, that wasn't widely known. So he wouldn't disagree with that. But in general, you get this picture of the Orient as other, which is used for colonialist imperialist purposes. That was the argument. But it wasn't basically for Said white. Now, we might say, well, that's white. It was racist. But a lot of these Orientalists weren't racist, right? A lot of them loved India. That didn't stop them really not knowing about India or creating imaginary pictures of it.
Yeah, like there was William Jones and many like them. They loved India. They loved the culture. They loved discovering the literature.
Yeah, and William Jones for Said is the first Orientalist, and he loved India. I mean, he produced a weird version of it, a very weird version of it, but he loved it. He wasn't racist. I don't think he was racist. I mean, I'm sure they had a notion of civilizational hierarchies. In the end, they thought, or maybe not him, not Jones, maybe didn't think this, because some of them thought ancient Sanskrit cultures, or some of them even thought ancient Buddhist cultures were superior to Western cultures. Some of them did think that.
Yeah.
Didn't necessarily mean they got Buddhism culture or Sanskrit cultures right. They idealized it falsely. It could work in all kinds of ways. These things are complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated. It's true. And the question of that Dr. Mohammed asked, description of political culturalism. He has,
Same question. We've got
no,
to figure out.
he has actually explained something. I'll just show it. Political culturalism, like libertarianism, realist way of political ideology and process. As like Orientalism or Anglicist movement is like a part of imperialist political cultural facts or forms.
Okay. I think that way of thinking is more political theory. Said was a literary scholar. He was, Said had two sides to him. He was a literary scholar and quite a traditional one, and he was an activist for Palestinian independence. And he didn't really think like that. He didn't think in terms of libertarianism or political realism. He didn't think like that. He thought in terms of ideology, images, language. So it's just not the way he himself thought. I mean, Said is interesting because he begins post-colonialism. I think that's true. But he's not really, doesn't think like all the other post-colonialists. So when you get post-colonialists like Gayatri Spivak or Homi Bhabha, or if you get the people in the same time, the very early ones in Australia, there were people doing it, post-colonialism, none of them thought like Said did. Said began it, was the most famous, encouraged other people to carry, but he was a very different way of thinking about things than anyone else.
I wrote one preface. Saad wrote Joe Sacco's graphic novel Palestine. Whatever we were talking about his relation with Palestine, the activism and everything, it's very much reflected in that small piece of writing. It's absolutely wonderful. It's read it few days ago.
Yes.
Absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. And he wrote a lot about. He wrote 3 or 4 books on Palestine.
Yeah, and that's just like him being a Palestinian and like he was an immigrant and everything. Does that meant is decolonized, whatever his views and thoughts or theories were different from the others. Does that
Yeah.
reflects?
I mean, one of the things about Said, he came from a very elite family. His parents were Christians, Arab Christians, and he was brought up in Egypt. And he was an Anglican. He went to posh private schools, and then he goes as an undergraduate to Harvard. So he's a total elite, Said, as were people like Homi Bhabha. Most of the post-colonialists who weren't white came from the very elite sections of their original societies, and that was true for Said. And I think that Christian Arab background he ditched religion. He became very anti-religious, as I say, but he learned English very early on. He spoke English and French, and Arabic, but English and French mainly when he was young. So that was the culture he came from. There was no real difficulty jumping as an undergraduate from Egypt to Harvard. In fact, I think he goes to school a bit in the States. So he's genuinely a sort of cosmopolitan elite child, Said. And without that, he wouldn't have been able to do it. And he becomes famous because of that, because that enables him to get a job at Columbia University, which, if you have a job in Columbia University, people pay more attention to you in America. And if people pay attention to you in America, they'll pay attention to you, in other countries as well.
Sure.
You can't do it from Kerala.
No.
He could have written Orientalism in 1978 in Kerala or in Malayalam. Nobody would have ever heard of it.
Yeah, that's true. Professor, if you permit, can we take 1-2 more questions from you too? If you have some time.
I'm happy, or we can. It's up to you. I'm at your.
Okay. Then we'll take. I've missed one question. I'm sorry. This is from Anurag.
Okay.
What do you think about the idea of mimicry by Homi Bhabha?
Well, I think Homi's essays of that period were terribly important. Everyone read them. We all read them. And the same with Gayatri's work of that period. It wasn't my kind of thing for two reasons. It was simply too abstract for me, just simply too abstract. It's too philosophical. And secondly, I think the actual relations between the colonizer and colonized are more complicated than his model lets you see. But on the other hand, what was so good about his work was that nobody else thought like that. Or, that's not quite true, but nobody had really brought those sorts of ideas into colonial relationships. But it's not how I would think about it. I don't think, I think if you're a Aboriginal person in Australia, the idea of mimicry has absolutely no relation whatsoever to your life. I think if you're a Dalit, and these are they're not actual concepts that really help you understand the thick history of colonialism cultures.
In Australia, some people are the products of stolen generations.
Well, that's more recent. Yes. Yeah. The stolen generation stuff and it's happening again. It's very hard to stop it. But Australia is one of the worst colonial powers in the world, and this is Australia, not Britain. You can't blame Britain for this. Australia had a white Australia policy. They really did believe that the Aboriginals would die out.
The assimilationist policy of Australia.
Yeah, Yeah, the assimilationist, and then that was based on that first they were going to all die, and then it was going to be assimilation, and then it was just genuine disregard, disrespect, neglect of a horrendous kind, associated alongside with the white Australia, which meant no Asians could come into Australia until quite recently. I mean, Aboriginals only became citizens of Australia, I think, in the late 60s or early 70s. They didn't have the vote. They had no social role. They were no official social role whatsoever. And there were no non-white people around Australia. So Australia has this appalling history, right, in these regards. But that's the Australian settler colonialists. It's not the imperialists as such. It's not the British imperialists. And in both Australia and in New Zealand, the British imperialists were better. The empire was probably better than the nation state for Indigenous people in both cases. Which is why, for instance, the Maori in New Zealand still have a very fond relation to the monarchy. They still believe in the monarchy in a way that most whites don't. And that's because the British colonial service tried to protect them in ways that the settler colonialists didn't. And that logic is quite common within the whole empire, versions of that. Australia is much worse than New Zealand, partly because of the different social differences between the Aboriginal people and the Maori. One thing is the Maori in New Zealand all spoke the same language. And here they had something like 700 different languages amongst the Aboriginal people. There were many, many different languages. They didn't necessarily understand each other.
The Virgins.
Yeah. So it was just and they were much more complicated, less hierarchical. Were stranger society, whereas the Polynesian societies were closer to the white societies. They were hierarchical. They had chiefs. They had sort of monarch figures. They mapped onto European in a much easier way. The Aboriginal societies are very, 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 very different.
Yes, and what is the condition? What do you say now? How the Aboriginal what exactly is happening now in Australia?
It's still
Cultural
bad.
condition.
It's still bad. They're very bad. The government don't give them proper recognition. Don't help them. Their incarceration rates, their health rates, their poverty rates, their alcoholism rates are amongst the worst in the world. It's an appalling scandal. It's just terrible. And it's very hard to know how to do that, because I think the white people in Australia don't really care much. I mean, some do, of course, some do. But the massive population don't care. Australia is quite a racist society. It's not structurally racist in the way the US is, but in an everyday life, it's racist. As a lot of South Asians who come to Australia will tell you. I've had a lot of friends who spend time in America and then come here, and they say the sort of racism that you might come across in the buses and stuff here is worse than in America. I think that's probably true. I mean, I don't think
it's news as well.
Yeah, you mightn't come across it so much in places like Melbourne and Sydney, but
when I took Dylan Coleman's interview, she told me that she's a social activist, and she is working for the indigenous health, and she's also a political activist.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, the Aboriginal people need all the activism they can get. I mean, but of course they have to do it for themselves. That's part of the problem is that it has to be local. It has to come from the communities themselves, and they need to have the structures in which they can do that. And then some of these societies are so damaged in a way that it's very hard for that to happen. And that's one of the reasons why it's very hard to fix. It's also very hard to fix because Australia is this huge country, right? It's just about as big as India, I think, although most of it's just desert, And a lot of the non-urban Aboriginals live a long way from anywhere. And it's very hard to, you can't, it's very hard to there's nothing much there, right? So it's very hard to get services to them and stuff. So it's a very intractable problem. I think it's slowly getting a bit better, perhaps, but it's not good. I think the incarceration rates, the rates of young Aboriginals in prison is increasing, and it's already horrendous.
Which country, which culture is facing
Yeah.
fights now? So,
And
Anuradha, yeah, please continue, Purvasha.
And the Australian Aboriginal writers, they spoke about the cultural genocide.
Yes.
Yeah, we come
Well, I
across
think these cultures just couldn't survive. No, they got destroyed. Yep, they got destroyed.
Yeah,
I
because
mean,
the
that's not sayable quite here, because Aboriginal people will deny that. At least some Aboriginal people will say that they still have their cultures. So so again, that's another problem, right? You can say, well, cultural genocide, and then what's left for the Aboriginal? You're saying, well, you don't have a culture, we killed it. And they'll say, no, we still, and they do, and I think they're right. I think there are places, not so much in the cities. When it comes to the city, it's cultural genocide, but back where they're living in their ancestral lands, a lot of those memories and practices are still in place today. They're hybridized, they're not the same, but there's something there. It's not all dead. It's not all been killed. Some of it survived. The Aboriginals are surviving. I mean, there's a lot of interest amongst white Australians, progressive white Australians, in how the Aboriginal lived with contact and what they ate. You can now go to restaurants and you can have Aboriginal food. That's all quite new in Australia, the last 5 years or so. The kind of real interest in Aboriginal culture. It's happening. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think they thought the subaltern. I don't know. I don't know. Was the Occident exotic from the subaltern perspective? I suppose the answer is yes and no. I mean, you would know the answer to that better than me. Was it? I mean, not to the educated Indian. I mean, a lot of Indians knew a lot about European culture from there were a lot of Indians who were very aware of what Europe was like. And nowadays, of course, many. We're cosmopolitan. We're all cosmopolitan. Here we are, chatting in English with the same references. There are differences, but it's not exotic, right? I wouldn't have called it exotic.
whatever, like we are, the way we live today, eat today, breathe today. That's so much impact of the English colonization.
Yeah.
Very much. We have a different culture altogether if the British haven't come. So
yeah,
we are
absolutely.
product of that also. You cannot deny what happened.
And also, you can't dissociate English colonization from global American dominance today, and the fact that we all speak English. I mean, capitalism, English is the language of international capitalism, and that's probably a result of the British Empire. But it's not only the British Empire, and the British now are not a major country. I mean, poor old England. England, India is a much more powerful, rich country than England today. I mean, isn't it? Has to be. I haven't looked at the stats. It has to be. It has to have a bigger turnout GDP, I assume. I think it's places like Australia. places like Australia, they're going to, if India says something and England says something, we'll listen to you first.
Well,
I'm sure.
and the last question from YouTube is from Tulika. As some critics point out that Orientalism is more about only biblical Orientalism rather than the whole concept of Orientalism. I personally don't think so, but I would like to know your opinion, sir.
I don't think so. No, I think nor for Said. Said talked about writers like Flaubert. He talked about anyone who created this monolithic, simplistic, abstract idea of the Orient as other and as exotic. He thought what Orientalists did was say that the Orient wasn't like us. It was completely different, and it was, it was more limited. It had it didn't have the same relation to rationality. And that's what Orientalism was. It was the picture of the Orient being this society trapped under, Oriental despotism, as Marx called it, being very religious, being very sexist, not allowing women freedom, not being interested in freedom. So it was a culture without Kantian rationality. And they produced this idea of that's what the Orient was. And it wasn't. A lot of people did that. Historians, philologists, novelists. A lot of there's this long analysis of Verdi's opera Aida as a culmination of Orientalism, which was staged in Cairo. But it is true that Said thought primarily of the Orient as what he knew, i.e., Egypt and the Middle East. I don't think Said knew a lot about India, and I don't think he writes about India that much, though he writes about Sir William Jones, who is connected to it. And that's been criticism of Said, was that his idea of the Orient wasn't Asia, it was Arab world, maybe Turkish.
So, in this time, like especially, someday COVID will go away. So, in the post-pandemic age, how do you think science will still be relevant to us with so much of globalization and everything going on?
Is that a question? Can you?
Yeah, it's asking you, like, what's your opinion on that?
Okay.
I mean, the post-pandemic age, things are going to change a lot.
Yeah,
Like
I'm having difficulty hearing for some reason. I've been all right so far.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I can hear you.
Yeah, is my voice breaking?
We're just sort of echoing or something. Yeah.
Okay. Is it better now?
Yeah, better now.
I was thinking, like, what do you think? I mean, the post-pandemic age, and after every pandemic, the last time it happened, we had the Roaring Twenties. So, like after this pandemic will be over someday, maybe in a few years. So what do you think? Scholars like Sites work, like how will it be relevant to our studies, and how the theories will be relevant to us in the post-pandemic age?
I think it's a very interesting question. How deeply will this pandemic go? I don't know. I don't think the 1919 flu had that much impact. I think the Roaring Twenties were caused by something else. There may be a bit of that, but I think things will change. I think this pandemic will change things, but I'm not sure how. I have no idea. I don't know. I think they'll make Zoom more popular, but I think the economy will roar back a bit, and that will create what you're talking about, of animal spirits, right? I think it's likely to see And that's already happened in places like Australia, where we don't have the pandemic anymore. Property prices, share prices are all going up very quickly. So that will happen. But I don't think that has much impact, unless it goes into inflation and crashes. It doesn't have that much impact on ordinary people, on our everyday life. For me, the worry is what's going to happen to global neoliberalism. Are we just going to get more and more of the market controlling everything, and that everything being about profit and about using people to create profits? And is the pandemic going to accelerate that, or is it going to slow it down? I think I don't know. I think there are some signs that it will make the state as against the market more popular. I think countries with a strong state, China, Australia has a strong state, have done a lot better than America, or probably Modi's India, which is an authoritarian state, but not an efficient state. So I think the notion of an efficient state might become more popular, as against just neoliberal, let the market, let private enterprise solve everything. Private enterprise can't deal with the pandemic. And that would be true of, if you look at 19th century pandemics like the cholera pandemic. Pandemics help state building in Europe and I think in Asia. They help state building because people realize to control these pandemics, you have to have a strong state. So that could happen. On the other hand, neoliberalism is so powerful that you think maybe they'll be able to use it to their advantage somewhere. I don't know. All right.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. I'll ask Purvasha if she has any last comments.
I think it's a rest session.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Simon Deering, for joining us today.
Okay.
Yes,
thank you very much. Okay, thank you. It's lovely to be with you. I only wish I could go out. I only wish I could go out to dinner with you. That would be nice, wouldn't it?
Yes.
All right.
I hope someday we can visit Australia. Okay. Professor has left the session, and thanks to all our viewers and participants for joining us today. Thank you so much. We'll end the live broadcast here now. And on 29th April, we have our next lecture on Professor Didier Coster, and we'll update you on our social media handles and our website. So stay tuned and subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.